We are looking at a ghost, not the spectral, chain-rattling kind, but a cultural ghost, a story so powerful it has haunted the 20th century and continues to whisper into the 21st. It's the story of a lost princess, the Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna of Russia. For most people, the name conjures a very specific image, likely born from the lavishly animated film from 1997. We see a spirited, amnesiac girl on a journey to Paris, singing about a dim memory, a music box, and a life she once knew. It is a story of romance, of identity, of finding home. It is a fairy tale. But what we are investigating today is the bedrock of fact beneath that fairy tale, and the first clue that something is profoundly wrong with the story we know is not in what the fairy tale tells us, but in what it meticulously leaves out. It omits the reason she was lost in the first place. It omits the cellar. It omits the chaos, the smoke, and the final desperate moments of a 17-year-old girl's life. The story we know is a carefully constructed fantasy. The real story is a forensic investigation that spanned 90 years. Our investigation begins where the fairy tale ends, with the brutal truth of what happened in a merchant's house in Yekaterinburg on the night of July 17th, 1918. The accepted narrative of the myth is that somehow, in the confusion of the execution of her family by Bolshevik revolutionaries, Anastasia survived. Perhaps she was wounded and rescued by a sympathetic soldier. Perhaps she was knocked unconscious and mistaken for dead. From this single seed of possibility, a forest of legends grew. Over the decades, dozens of women would come forward claiming to be the lost Grand Duchess. They appeared in Germany, in America, in the remote corners of Russia, each with a story of miraculous escape. Most were dismissed quickly as frauds or mentally ill, but one was different. One woman, known to the world as Anna Anderson, was so convincing that she waged a legal battle for decades to be recognized as Anastasia. Anna Anderson's story is a crucial layer of the myth. She surfaced in Berlin in 1920 after a suicide attempt. She had no identification and refused to speak for some time. When she did, the story she eventually told was one of terror and escape. She claimed a soldier named Tchaikovsky realized she was still breathing amongst the bodies of her family and carried her to safety. Her case became a global sensation. She had an uncanny resemblance to Anastasia. She seemed to recognize former members of the imperial court, and she possessed knowledge of intimate details of life inside the Alexander Palace that seemed impossible for an outsider to know. For many, she was the living proof. Former friends of the Romanovs and even some distant relatives became convinced. The world wanted to believe. Here was a survivor, a living link to a world of elegance and order that had been violently swept away. Her legal fight to prove her identity became one of the longest-running cases in German history, lasting from 1938 to 1970. The courts ultimately ruled against her, stating her claim was not proven. But that legal ambiguity was enough. For her supporters, it meant the establishment was hiding the truth. For the public, it meant the mystery remained. Anna Anderson lived out her life in the United States, dying in 1984, still insisting she was Anastasia. She is, in many ways, the primary architect of the modern myth. Her story provides the template for the animated film and countless books. It is a story of survival against all odds. But what if the odds were not just immense, but absolute? To understand that, we have to leave the courtroom dramas and the romanticized escapes. We have to go back to the source. We must enter the cellar of the Ipatiev house, the place the Bolsheviks called the House of Special Purpose. Our primary guide into that room is the man who orchestrated the killings, Yakov Yurovsky. He was the commandant of the House of Special Purpose, and he left a detailed, chillingly bureaucratic account of the night's events. It is not a story of a clean, efficient execution. It is a document of brutal, chaotic failure. According to Yurovsky's report, sometime after midnight, the family, Tsar Nicholas, Tsarina Alexandra, their 4 daughters Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and their son, the young Tsarevich Alexei, were woken. They were told there was unrest in the town and that they needed to move to the basement for their own safety. With them went their family doctor, Eugene Botkin, their valet, Alexei Trupp, their cook, Ivan Karitonov, and the Tsarina's maid, Anna Demidova. 11 people in total were led down into a small, empty cellar room. Let's pause and examine the scene. This is not a grand throne room or a battlefield. It is a cramped, semi-basement room, measuring roughly 26 by 21 feet. The windows were boarded. There was only one entrance. Yurovsky brought in 3 chairs. Nicholas, Alexandra, and Alexei sat. The 4 Grand Duchesses and the staff stood behind them. Yurovsky then brought in his execution squad, a group of about a dozen men armed with a variety of handguns. He read a short statement from the Ural Executive Committee declaring them sentenced to death. According to witnesses, Nicholas turned to his family, stunned, and could only stammer, "What? What?" before Yurovsky personally fired a pistol at his chest. That was the signal. The room erupted in gunfire. This is the first moment where the myth of a clean escape begins to disintegrate. The room was far too small for such a large firing squad. The air instantly filled with thick, acrid smoke from the black powder of the bullets. The men were firing wildly in a confined space, the bullets ricocheting off the stone walls. It was a scene of total pandemonium. When the shooting first stopped and the smoke began to clear, the executioners were horrified to find that not everyone was dead. The Tsar, the Tsarina, and a few of the servants were gone, but several of the children were still alive. Yurovsky's report describes the scene with cold precision. The Tsarevich Alexei, who was only 13, was still groaning on the floor. Several of the Grand Duchesses were also moving. One of the executioners, Peter Ermakov, reportedly tried to finish them off with a bayonet. Here we encounter a truly bizarre and horrifying detail, one that turns the scene from a mere execution into something almost medieval. The bayonets failed. The girls' torsos seemed to be protected by some kind of armour. The executioners were mystified and terrified. In the smoke-filled, blood-soaked room, it must have seemed like the imperial children were somehow supernaturally protected. The truth was far more mundane and far more tragic. For months, knowing their jewels might be confiscated, the Tsarina and her daughters had been methodically sewing their diamonds, pearls, and other gems into the linings of their corsets and undergarments. They had created makeshift, diamond-studded armour. It was their fortune, their only hope for a future, sewn into the clothes on their backs. And in their final moments, this hidden wealth served only to prolong their agony. The bullets from the first volley had been deflected by the jewels. The bayonets could not penetrate the tightly packed gems. The commander, Yurovsky, seeing the failure and the panic among his men, took control. He walked through the room and systematically shot each of the survivors in the head with his own pistol. He describes shooting Alexei. He describes finishing the daughters. Another guard, Pavel Medvedev, later testified that the entire execution took 20 minutes. 20 minutes of gunfire, smoke, screaming, bayonet thrusts, and close-range pistol shots in a tiny, enclosed space. We must ask a critical question here. In this meticulously documented environment of absolute carnage, where every survivor of the initial volley was systematically dispatched, what is the realistic probability of a 17-year-old girl not only surviving, but escaping unnoticed. The accounts of the killers themselves are our primary evidence. While they differ on minor details, they are unanimous on the central fact: everyone died. One guard, Alexei Kabanov, recalled stepping over the bodies to check pulses. Yurovsky, in his report, is clinical. He notes that after the killing, the bodies were carried out on stretchers made from bedsheets and loaded onto a truck. The next phase of his operation was even more grim: the disposal of the evidence. He had a site prepared in a forest outside Yekaterinburg called Ganina Yama, a collection of abandoned mine shafts. The plan was to dump the bodies down a mine and destroy them with grenades and acid. This is where the story takes another turn, and where, for decades, a sliver of doubt was allowed to persist. The disposal was as botched as the execution. Yurovsky's truck got stuck in the mud on the way to the mines. The area was becoming less secure, with anti-Bolshevik White Army forces closing in on the city. He realized the mine shaft at Ganina Yama was too shallow and the bodies might be discovered. A new, frantic plan was hatched. He ordered his men to retrieve the bodies. 2 of them, he decided, should be burned separately to confuse anyone who might later find the mass grave. He chose the youngest, the heir, Alexei, and one of his sisters. The remaining 9 bodies were taken to a different location, a short distance away on a road known as the Koptyaki Road. There, they were doused in sulfuric acid to disfigure them and buried in a shallow pit, over which the men laid railway ties and drove the truck back and forth to conceal the disturbed earth. This secret, 2-part burial is the key. For 70 years, the location of the bodies remained a secret, known only to a handful of Bolsheviks who took the knowledge to their graves. The Soviet government officially remained silent, neither confirming nor denying the fate of the Romanovs. This official silence created a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed the stories of survivors. It was the perfect breeding ground for a myth. Without bodies, there was no definitive proof. Without proof, there was hope. The story of Anastasia, particularly as embodied by Anna Anderson, thrived in this environment of uncertainty. It was a mystery built on a foundation of missing evidence. That foundation began to crumble in 1979. A local geologist and amateur historian named Alexander Avdonin, guided by the secret writings of one of Yurovsky's sons, located the burial pit on the Koptyaki Road. Along with a filmmaker named Geli Ryabov, he secretly exhumed 3 skulls from the site to confirm his findings. It was still the Soviet era, and revealing such a discovery was politically impossible and dangerous. They reburied the skulls, documented their location, and waited. They waited for over a decade. Their moment came in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. As the new Russian government began to grapple with its past, Avdonin and Ryabov came forward with their discovery. An official exhumation was ordered. What the investigators found in that muddy pit was a tangle of skeletons. The scene matched Yurovsky's description with uncanny accuracy. They found 9 bodies. Forensic analysis began immediately. The skulls were reconstructed. The skeletons were examined for clues. One skull had a gold dental bridge consistent with Dr. Botkin. Another showed signs of a bayonet wound to the pelvis, matching Anna Demidova, the maid who was reported to have been finished with a bayonet. The skeletons of the Tsar and Tsarina were identified through skeletal analysis and comparison to photographs. Everything seemed to fit, but there was a problem, a huge problem. There were 9 bodies. There should have been 11. 2 were missing. A count of the skeletons confirmed it. The bodies of the Tsarevich Alexei and one of the Grand Duchesses were not in the grave. This discovery sent a shockwave through the world. The myth, which had been slowly fading, was suddenly reignited with explosive force. The missing princess was no longer just a fantasy. It was now a scientific possibility supported by the evidence from the grave itself. The the question became, which daughter was missing? Forensic anthropologists initially believed it was Anastasia, based on height estimates from the skeletons. The media seized on this. The lost princess, the survivor, was Anastasia. For many, this was the confirmation they had been waiting for. The story was true, but science was not finished. The next step was to move beyond bones and into the world of genetics. This is where the investigation becomes a high-stakes international scientific endeavour. Scientists needed a way to definitively prove that the remains from the Yekaterinburg grave belonged to the Romanovs. They turned to DNA analysis, specifically mitochondrial DNA or mtDNA. Unlike nuclear DNA, which is a mix from both parents, mtDNA is passed down almost unchanged from mother to child through the maternal line. This makes it incredibly useful for tracing family lineage. The Tsarina Alexandra was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria of Great Britain. This meant her mtDNA sequence would be shared by many of her living maternal relatives. The scientists needed a confirmed relative to provide a sample for comparison. They found one in Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, the husband of Queen Elizabeth II. His maternal grandmother was Alexandra's sister. He agreed to provide a blood sample. The results were unambiguous. The mtDNA extracted from the bones of the Tsarina and the 3 female children found in the grave was a perfect match to Prince Philip's. This was conclusive proof. The remains belonged to the Empress and 3 of her daughters. A similar process was used for the Tsar. His mtDNA was compared to that of living descendants of his maternal line, and again, it was a perfect match. The science was solid. The grave on the Koptiaki Road contained the Romanovs. But this triumph of science only deepened the central mystery. It proved who was in the grave, which also proved who was not. Alexei and one of his sisters were still missing. For nearly 2 more decades, the question lingered. Where were they? And did their absence mean they had somehow escaped? During this period, the Anna Anderson case was also put to the ultimate scientific test. When she died in 1984, some of her tissue was preserved from a hospital procedure. In 1994, scientists were able to extract DNA from this sample. They compared it not to the Romanovs, but to the known relatives of a missing Polish factory worker named Franziska Szankowska, who was the leading candidate for Anderson's true identity. The DNA was a perfect match. Anna Anderson was not Anastasia Romanov. She was a Polish woman who had suffered from mental illness after a factory explosion. The great pretender, the living heart of the myth for over 60 years, was a fraud. And yet, the central mystery remained. A body was still missing from the grave. Even with Anderson debunked, the possibility of a real survivor couldn't be completely dismissed. We are now entering the final phase of our investigation. The mystery hinges entirely on the location of the second, smaller burial site, mentioned only in Yurovsky's report. He described burning 2 bodies and burying the remains nearby. For years, archaeologists and researchers scoured the area around Ganina Yama and the main grave, but found nothing. It seemed the secret of the final resting place of the last 2 Romanov children was lost forever. But a small group of local enthusiasts, led by builder and historian Vitaly Shitov, refused to give up. They were not professional archaeologists, but they were driven by a passion for their local history and a desire to solve this last piece of the puzzle. They meticulously reread the witness testimonies, re-examined old maps, and cross-referenced Yurovsky's account with the landscape itself. Yurovsky's report was the key. He had described the location of the main grave as being under railway ties on a small bridge over a boggy patch of road. He then mentioned the second site was nearby. The searchers realised that previous efforts may have been looking in the wrong places. focusing on the more dramatic Ganina Yama mine shafts. Instead, this local team focused on the mundane stretch of the old Koptiaki road. They used metal detectors and probing rods, systematically searching the forest floor, and in the summer of 2007, almost 89 years to the day after the murders, they found something. About 70 meters from the main grave, they discovered a small depression in the earth. It was a bonfire pit. As they began to excavate, what they found was horrifying and conclusive. They unearthed 44 small, burned bone fragments and teeth. They found shards from a container of sulfuric acid. They found nails from a wooden box, and they found bullets of various calibers, matching the types of guns used by the execution squad. The scene was a perfect match for Yurovsky's description of the second disposal site, where he had attempted to burn the bodies of Alexei and one of his sisters. The fragments were carefully collected and sent for analysis at multiple international laboratories, including the United States Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory. This was the moment of truth. The science had to be impeccable, beyond any doubt. The challenge was immense. The bone fragments were severely damaged by fire and acid. Extracting usable DNA would be incredibly difficult. But forensic science had advanced significantly since the tests in the 1990s. The labs were able to extract both mtDNA and, crucially, nuclear DNA from the fragments. The results came back in 2008 and were published in 2009. The mitochondrial DNA from the fragments matched the profile of Tsarina Alexandra, confirming the remains belonged to her children. The nuclear DNA testing went even further. It established the sex of the two individuals. One was male, the other female. The DNA from the male child was a perfect match to the Tsar's and also showed the specific genetic marker for haemophilia, the disease that had famously plagued the Tsarevich Alexei. There was no longer any doubt. The male remains were those of Alexei Nikolaevich. The DNA from the female child was a match to her parents and 3 sisters in the other grave. The family was now genetically complete. All 11 victims from the cellar were accounted for. 9 in the first grave and 2 in the second. There were no survivors. There were no escapes. The story of the lost princess was over, definitively ended not by a confession or a historical document, but by the cold, irrefutable language of genetic code. So what are we left with? We have dismantled a fairy tale and replaced it with a grim forensic report. We have followed the trail from a romantic animated musical to a muddy secret grave. The investigation is complete, but the most important question remains: why? Why did this myth have such a powerful hold on us for so long? Why did the world need Anastasia to have survived? The answer, I think, is not about one girl. It is about what she represented. The execution of the Romanovs was not just the murder of a family. It was the symbolic execution of an entire world. It represented the violent, messy birth of a new and frightening century, one defined by ideological extremism and mass violence. In the face of this brutality, the idea of a single survivor, an innocent child who somehow escaped the slaughter, was a powerful symbol of hope. It suggested that something pure, something from the old world, had endured. Anastasia became a vessel for a collective wish, a wish that innocence could outwit brute force, a wish that even in the darkest cellar, a single light could escape. The Anna Anderson case thrived because it gave this wish a human face. People believed her not because the evidence was strong, but because they wanted to believe the story she was telling. Her story affirmed that survival was possible, that the past was not entirely lost. The myth also served a political purpose. For Russian émigrés and monarchists scattered across the globe, a surviving Grand Duchess was a potential rallying point, a living symbol of legitimacy against the Soviet regime. For the Soviets, the ambiguity was also useful. By never officially confirming the deaths, they left a lingering question mark that prevented the family from being turned into martyrs by the White Russians and the Orthodox Church. The myth was a ghost that served many masters. It was a story flexible enough to be a personal tragedy, a political symbol, and eventually a Disney-style fairy tale. But the truth, as we have seen, is often less comforting than the stories we tell ourselves. The reality is that Anastasia was not a fairy tale princess. She was a 17-year-old girl. By all accounts, she was the joker of the family, bright and mischievous. She did photography. She had a dog named Jimmy. She was, in the end, just a person, a young woman on the cusp of her life, and that life was extinguished in the most brutal way imaginable. Not for who she was, but for what she symbolized. Her death was not clean or heroic. It was prolonged, terrifying, and messy. The jewels sewn into her clothes, a symbol of her status and her family's hope for the future, became an instrument of torture, prolonging her death. There is a horrifying intellectual irony in that detail. The scientific investigation that finally brought this story to a close is, in its own way, a remarkable narrative. It is a story of persistence, of amateur historians who would not let a secret lie, and of scientists who could read the faint traces of truth left in burned bone. It demonstrates that even after decades of lies, silence, and myth-making, the physical evidence of the past can endure. The truth was not found in the memories of courtiers or the claims of impostors. It was written in the genetic code of the victims themselves, waiting patiently in the Russian soil to be read. It is a testament to the power of the scientific method to cut through layers of legend and deliver a hard, verifiable conclusion. So what have we uncovered? We began with a question about a ghost, a cultural memory of a lost princess. Our investigation took us through the layers of the myth, from the cinematic fantasy to the real-world drama of its most famous imposter. Then we went deeper, into the primary historical accounts of the execution itself, uncovering a story far more brutal and chaotic than any myth could convey. Finally, we followed the trail of the bodies, a 90-year forensic journey that led from a hidden mass grave to a final fiery pit in the forest. Each layer stripped away more of the fairy tale, replacing it with increasingly grim and complex facts. The journey is the argument. We did not start with a thesis to prove, but with an anomaly to investigate. The persistence of a story against the weight of historical probability. By following the evidence, from Yurovsky's report to the mitochondrial DNA analysis, we arrive at a conclusion that is not imposed, but discovered. The pattern that emerges is one of human need, the need for hope in the face of tragedy, the need for order in the face of chaos, the need for a story that makes sense of senseless violence. The Anastasia myth is a monument to that need. Now, our understanding is reframed. When you encounter the story of Anastasia, whether it is in a movie, a book, or a documentary, you are no longer looking at a simple mystery of a lost princess. You are looking at a complex intersection of history, trauma, science, and the profound human capacity for storytelling. You are seeing the echo of a violent revolution and the political maneuvering of the Cold War. You are witnessing the desperate hope of a traumatized generation and the relentless, methodical pursuit of forensic truth that finally answered their questions. The story is not about whether she survived. The real story is about why we so desperately needed her to. The ghost of Anastasia is not the spirit of one lost girl. It is the reflection of our own desire to believe that even from the blood and ashes of history, a fairy tale can somehow be true. It is not, and accepting that fact does not diminish her tragedy. It restores her humanity